So recently, a developer's note from Inkwell, the head of the Western Maplestory development, dropped, and a lot of people have been excited for the upcoming changes to the game, and yeah, rightfully so. But there's one section in this patch preview that just rubs me the wrong way, and that is the introduction of familiars to Cernium. You've seen the title of this video. I think introducing familiars to Cernium is going to slow down or even grieve my progression, and I do really hate that this is the way they chose to address this huge familiar issue that we have in the game right now and have had in the game for a very long time. Also, I feel like nobody's even talking about this as if this wouldn't be an issue right now. I feel like I'm gaslighting myself into thinking that there's an issue, while no, actually, this is an issue that needs to be talked about. Right now, our favorite Maple streamers and YouTubers, as well as all the people whose whole content it is just to read out the patch notes, everybody is praising every single bit of this update, and I feel like there needs to be someone like me to say that introducing familiars to Cernium isn't really a satisfying change at all. I'm not making this video just to be a quirky contrarian or so that I have something to put into this week's episode, right? No, I really feel like introducing familiars to Cernium is going to hurt my progression. But how can this be the case? Up until now, we had to choose between gambling for familiar gains in Limina and the guaranteed gains that we could get through farming fragments. And now we get both, right? The question is, how can this be a bad thing? And in order to understand my point, you will need to understand where I'm coming from and how I went about progressing my character up to this point. So I've been documenting my progression here on YouTube almost weekly for about 1.5 years by now. I started this character with the Ignition update, and yeah, this guy was my first hyperburner that I took to 250. This took me pretty much 2 weeks to accomplish, and from 250 to 275, I spent my time farming out familiars, first in the Labyrinth of Suffering and then in Limina. This took me from week 2 of my progression series until week 30. Don't worry, 6 job wasn't a thing during that time, so I didn't really have to compromise on the fragment income in order to farm my familiars. But what I had to compromise on was experience and later on also mesos, since I was starting to be so far out of level range that my meso income as well as my XP gains took a huge hit. If I compare myself to other people right now that did not spend the time in Limina to go farming for familiars during that time and just grinded it out in Cernium, Hotel and above, I noticed that these people have not only been hitting 285 by now, or a lot earlier than me, but also some of those people are already 290. Just to build a bridge towards the discussion that we are about to have, they have not gambled for familiars in Limina, but went with the guaranteed and not fragments, because fragments didn't exist yet, right? But they went with the guaranteed symbol stat through unlocking the higher areas earlier, the guaranteed experience, which was a lot higher than in Limina, the guaranteed meso income without the being out of level range reduction penalty. And both of these things, both of these points are of course being compounded by the fact that the Cernium and above maps have a higher mob density, so they were getting even more XP and mesos than me. On top of that, through the extra experience they were getting, they are now doing more final damage through the level difference multiplier, which does account for a huge amount of damage on bosses. If we take a look at this multiplier, we can see that I'm currently hitting plus 5.84% final damage to normal Carling, while somebody that is to 90 by now is hitting plus 20% final damage on Carling. That big difference is something that I now have to make up for with the familiars that I farmed. Alright, so this should give you some perspective on where I'm coming from when I'm saying that adding familiars to Cernium is going to hurt my progression. But at least I could grind some familiars, right? So let's check out what spending 7 months in Limina to grind familiars has gotten me. Alright, so starting off with my damage setup, this is probably the thing that you are wondering about the most. I got a 30% boss damage, 30% boss damage, and a 20% boss damage familiar. On top of that, I do have 2 ID familiars, one with 20% ID and another one with 30% ID and a small amount of party healing. When it comes to other healing familiars, I got 3 familiars that have 2 lines of healing through either, party, ally, or just myself. And when it comes to my farming setup, my large drop familiar has a 3% critical damage line on it, and besides that, I'm rocking 2 Auto Steal Familiars. And this is basically all I got. I have not seen the Meso Familiar, nor have I seen the Item Drop Familiar. So, with that being shown off, do you think it was worth it for me to spend many months of my time playing, making less mesos and getting less experience than my peers to gamble for familiars? But I hear you already saying, now it's different. Now we can farm familiars and grind for fragments. So now we can gamble and have guaranteed gains, right? And that's exactly the point I want to zoom in on. So with familiars most likely being introduced to Cernium as well as Burnium, judging by the icon on the infographic, I am here to ask the question, what does it even mean to have familiars in these two areas? And in order to answer this question, we will begin by taking a look at the Maplestory GMS mob spawn sheet. I've already sorted this by the maximum mob count that you can reach in a descending order. And just to give you an example, if this is the first time you are looking at this, I'm currently grinding in Eteria in the map Top Deck Passage 4. It has a capacity for 39 mobs, 40 individual mob spawn points, and you can roughly reach 18,720 mobs an hour. This is gonna be the baseline for me because I'm already 284 and I'm about to move into Cassion where most maps will have this amount of mob spawn. Now, let's take a look at the other areas. So we can see, of course, Cassion has many maps that have this sort of mob spawn. Then Eteria has many maps. Even Shangri-La has a lot of maps that you can farm 18.7k mobs in. But here we have Odium. And in Odium, there aren't really a lot of maps that you can reach 18.7k mobs in. But there's also this right here, 18.2k mobs in Castle's Gate 4. From here on out, and the lower you go in these Sacred Force areas, the lower mob counts you will be able to encounter. We see that in Hotel Arcus, for example, there's no map that supports 18.7k mobs an hour. And the same is also true for Burning Cernium and Cernium. So in Burning Cernium and Cernium, we have only 4 maps that you can reach up to 18.2k mobs in. So if we consider 18.7k the maximum, we can't even reach the maximum mob count in Burning Cernium or Cernium. And this means that we are already losing out on fragments and mesos when we consider going down to these maps. But this isn't even the end of the story. If you take a look at the mob level here on the right side, you can see that in the Library 3 and Library 6, the mobs are level 264, which means that if you aren't within 10 levels of this, so once you are 275, you will be starting to lose mesos in these maps. And in order to figure out how much mesos we lose, I would like to show you my second favorite site, and that is the strategy wiki here, specifically the formulas section of this wiki. So what you're seeing on this page is what I just told you. If you are within 10 levels, either above or below the mob that you are farming, you will get 100% of the mesos that the mob drops, right? Or in other words, you will get a 0% penalty. But as soon as you move out of that level range, you will start to be punished. And in this case, let's assume I'm already 285 by the time this update drops. I will put in 285 minus 264 in order to figure out the correct penalty, and you can see I'm already at minus 25% meso income if I'm going down to that map. On top of the map being worse overall because it supports less mob than any of the Castion maps that I could go to instead. On top of that, let's check out the experience-related level advantage formula. And here you can see if you are within 1 level, you get 20% bonus EXP. But we are going to be 21 levels above, which means that we will receive an 11% final XP penalty instead of getting bonus experience when grinding in Castion, right? On top of the already way lower mob base experience. So are you seeing how this can potentially hurt my progression here? I already spent 7 months of my time playing Maplestory, acquiring mediocre familiars, while other people have spent a single afternoon grinding Oda warriors that have boss damage alongside ID on the same familiar, And in order to catch up to those people, I will probably have to spend not only the next 7 months grinding familiars in Cernium, but rather the next, what is it, 7 years maybe? But at least I'm making guaranteed fragment gains, right? Yes, of course, we are getting gains. But like I already established, we are making less fragment gains than if we were to farm in the maps that we are supposed to be farming in within our level range. And then for how long is this argument even gonna hold up, right? Because there are already a couple of people that have their 6 job maxed, and I myself, I'm probably like 5 months away from having it maxed or something like that. So to them, going down to farm familiars is just straight up worse than doing it on another character, right? And you can say, okay, now I get to farm fragments on my secondary character while also getting familiars for the main, right? Great, but that's just not me. I don't have a secondary character that I am willing or wanting to farm fragments on. I don't care. I want to farm fragments on my main efficiently in the map that I would already be farming in. But again, I hear you say, this is only the first step. This is only the first step, right? Right? Is it the first step, guys? I mean, they did add familiars to Moras in 2020, right? And now in 2024, we have familiars in all of the Arcane River regions. It's great, right? Right? Is that the case? Well, I don't know about that. Nobody can be sure about anything right now because it's written in the patch notes that they are only still continuing to consider to add more familiars to the other continental Grandest regions, right? And that sentence right there is really why I'm making this video to begin with. Continuing to consider. Continuing to consider is such a piece of gaslighting language. I have no trust in this company since they removed the drop coupons in rec servers, and this sort of language just speaks volumes to me. If they would have just obligated themselves here to release familiars to more Grandest regions in the following updates by stating it here, I would have had no issue with any of this. But dude, this just makes me so angry, and here's why. From these couple of sentences, it is screamingly obvious to me that the question at the Nexon headquarters is still not what can we do to make the game the most enjoyable it can be. No. Hell no. The real question that the people in the Nexon HQ are asking is how little can we give the players to silence the outrage? And that is exactly what happened here. Instead of giving us familiars in all Grandest regions or just introducing red cards to reboot, they have chosen to give us this. And let's not pretend that this is not going to be a big deal. In a community where all of your achievements are condensed down to how much damage you can do in 35 seconds on a dummy in Dojo, especially as a class that brings no party buffs to the table and only has its damage output, yeah, I think being 15% final damage behind somebody who's, in the proper damage level multiplier is a pretty big deal. And still, because familiars will now exist in Cernium, I feel obligated to farm there in order to hit the jackpot and improve my current familiar setup. But if I don't hit the jackpot, it's straight up going to be a loss for me. Others have said that they would only go down to farm familiars in Cernium once they hit 290, but at that point the meso penalty will not only be minus 25% anymore, but a whopping minus 65%. Feels great, man. Yeah, it's not a great decision to make, and I hate having to make a decision. I hate having to choose between the two options now, because the alternative would have been so nice. Just add the familiars in Cassion, or in all regions. I mean, don't only add them to Cassion, that would be hella malicious, but just adding them to Cernium is also just malicious. So with that being said, I just wanted to get my opinion on this matter out there because I feel like this has been ignored by the majority of the community. Maybe the majority of the community is also not impacted, but the people who are impacted, like me, haven't seemed to have spoken up or anything. I feel like I've never heard anybody bring up this opinion. And This, like I said earlier, I feel like I'm gaslighting myself, but honestly, this update is ass. And to be honest, I really mean it. This update just doubles down on all of the other FOMO mechanics that are already in this game. And I hear you saying, if you don't like having familiars in Cernium, don't grind there, right? Because you are the small audience that is left for this game that still endures this torture. All the other people have already left, and all that I want is for this game to be better than this.